Okay, awesome. All right, so we're in chapter 41 over here, which chapter 41 is the conversation started off with the awe or the fear of God, which is a very, very important tool in serving God. We discussed at length last week how it is the basis and the root of all divine service, accepting the yoke of God upon yourself, accepting that what God asks of you is what you're going to do. I even wrote about it somewhat in my email this week. It's about devotion. We have to recall is that the purpose of the Tanya is to teach us to serve God, and serving God means we accept upon ourselves to do what He says. That's what it means to serve. Maybe later in today's discussion, we will delve deeper into awe. But before he does that, he wants to first give us a very important point, which the Alter Rebbe repeats this point in the Tanya multiple times. We've had it in earlier chapters. We're going to have it here again, and we're going to have it later. And the basic point is what happens when your meditations don't work? Okay, so there's some of us that um, don't get emotionally excited. Okay, or even those of us who do get emotionally excited, maybe around spiritual things we don't get emotionally excited, or maybe we're not yet getting emotionally excited. And so, if the whole Tanya is about teaching us to have emotional feelings towards God, right? The two wings that lift our mitzvahs, the awe of God and the love of God. Then what happens when the actual feeling is missing? And I'll even add on to the question, even if let's say you do sometimes feel it, but you don't always feel it, right? You don't always feel that emotional connection with God. So the question is your divine service of God missing? Are your wings gone? Is your service of God lacking when you don't actually feel the emotions? And that would be a very a depressing thought because the reality is, as the Tanya's mentioned, is that ultimately uh, our thoughts are within our power, our emotions not necessarily. And therefore, if we were to make the argument that, which, he explained so well and eloquently why emotions are important, but if we're going to say that if you lack emotion, that your divine service of God is lacking, that would be a very difficult situation for all of us to find ourselves in. And so that is why the Tanya over here in section 6 is going to tell us that um, if you do not feel emotion, then you're still okay. And I want to point out that in the Hasidic worldview, this is actually unique. Okay, this idea that if you just meditate about the concepts and you did not create actual emotional connection, that is enough. This is actually unique to Chabad Chasidis, not other streams of Hasidism. Because remember, what did in general Hasidism bring to the world? Hasidism brought the emotional connection, right? In other words, there was a very cold Judaism before Hasidism, and Hasidism added an emotional warmth to Judaism. And the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya explains at length very much why that's important, why that's beautiful, why it's necessary, and why one should attempt at all costs to reach an emotional feeling and connection to God. Nevertheless, unlike other Hasidic groups, where really they don't necessarily, in other words, the real difference between other Hasidic groups and the Chabad Hasidic group was how much of the actual Hasidic philosophy did the average person study. And in other Hasidic groups, they didn't really study a lot, or even what they studied was very short and brief Hasidic thoughts. Okay, so I don't know, like anybody ever here bought like just give an example. Okay, if you go, Tzvi Freeman has these great short meditations, right? Let's look up one on Chabad.org. Okay, so other Hasidic Tzvi Freeman, I forget what it's called. What it's called? Heaven on Earth. Heaven and Earth. I forget what it's called. It's just to really give you an example. If you look at the writings of the Baal Shem Tov, all of his writings were very, very short. And that was really originally by design. The deep, I'm just looking for my book of the Baal Shem Tov, the deep, lengthy Hasidic discourses that you see, okay? When you study, we have studied some of the Hasidic discourses, those deep, lengthy, very, involved studies were very was not the original Hasidic dynasty. The original Hasidic dynasty was there was the Rebbe, there was his prize students who would study Hasidic philosophy at depth, and then there would be the average Chassid who would just read short snippets and be inspired by that. Okay, so I'll just give you an example. Here's an example of like a short snippet of a Hasidic thought. Okay, all right, here it is. When it all began, and by the way, it's a beautiful thought, but it's just to give you an example. When it all began, heaven was here on earth. This physical earthly world was more than any of the higher spiritual worlds, was the place where the very essence of God's infinite light could be found. But humankind step by step banished that divine presence from its home with the tree of knowledge, with the man who murdered his brother, with all those things that human beings do. Since humankind chased it away, only humankind can bring it back, and this began with Abraham, who proclaimed oneness for all the world. And it ends with us. Our generation will bring heaven back down to earth. Now that is a powerful thought, a beautiful thought, and an empowering thought. Okay, it says it in short, but it's basically saying we human beings are the one that chased God out of this earth. Therefore, it will be us human beings that will bring God down to this earth. However, this is just a short thought. Okay, it's not a well-developed thought. It's not parsed out in depth. That's a quote. Okay, the Rebbe took this general thought and developed it over 40 years with multiple Hasidic discourses delving into the depth of this idea. Okay? So my point is, though one can be inspired by a short little section, there's not really enough for lengthy meditation. Okay? In order to fully, in other words, in Chabad Chassidic philosophy, to truly have a fully meditate, to truly meditate about something, you have to be able to analyze it from all angles. Okay, just to give an example, right? If I spoke about this another time, a physical object has parameters, and when you can grasp it by all its parameters, right? If you want to buy a phone, you look up how much RAM does it have, what is its camera capabilities, right? Some people just say, look, here's a phone. It works really well, snaps great photos, and works really fast. But for a lot of phone junkies, that's not going to sell the phone to them. They need to understand all the different details of the phone. They want to know how much RAM it can hold, how fast its processor is, what type of processor, what its battery, and whatever all, screen brightness, whatever specs, and that really allows them to, even without seeing the phone, to truly grasp the phone, to fully understand the phone, to fully have that phone pictured in their mind, even if they've never seen it. And a similar concept, lahavdil, is when we talk about God. God is not something that we can see, and or all spiritual things. And so the more details you know about spirituality, the more your mind's eye can wrap your head around it, and the more your mind's eye can appreciate it and truly connect with it and feel it. And that's really what Chabad Chassidic philosophy is about. It's about taking spiritual concepts and understanding them at great depth. So, right, we can talk about, oh, God, gives life to the world. God has a more encompassing energy. God has a more detailed energy. But those are very, very general statements. Those statements are parsed apart at length, in depth, in multiple ways. And the more you delve into those topics, the more you appreciate what it truly means that God gives life to the world, what it means that God is nevertheless separate from the world, what it means how God has not changed. All those topics cannot truly be understood from just a 2-paragraph thought. So going back to my point, the original Hasidic movement was just that. It was a bunch of short little thoughts that, okay, the deep and developed students could read the entire depth in the short thought, but the average Jew could just listen to that thought and get excited. Okay? Chabad Chassidic, again, came and said, no, we want all Jews, not just the prized students, to be able to study all these topics at depth, understand it in all different angles. And therefore, what comes out goes like this. If you are a chassid, but not a Chabad chassid, really what matters is not the learning, but what matters is feeling that emotional connection. So if you were, let's say, a Vidnitzer Chassid or you were a Karliner Chassid, and you did not feel the emotional connection in their way of serving God, you would seriously be lacking. Because since their entire focus is on awakening that emotional connection, um, then then if you're lacking that, you're missing everything. The Chabad philosophy is like this: emotions can never be promised, but the mind, what we think about and what we meditate on, can be. And therefore, the Tanya makes the argument here and in other places is that if you've tried your best and you've meditated deeply about the concept and you've thought about it, and you still don't come to any emotional feeling, that's not your fault, and you have done what you can, and your divine service of God is considered a complete divine service because you have utilized your mind to the fullest extent, to the best that of your ability. I just want to present to you one more story that illustrates the difference between Chabad Chasidis and other Chasidis. And I should note, Chabad Chasidis today has done a very good job in spreading Chabad Chasidis to other Hasidic groups as well. So I'm not saying that anybody in other Hasidic groups doesn't have what Chabad has, or at least not to a certain extent today. Obviously, we have the whole picture, but it's been a very beautiful thing that the teachings of the Alter Rebbe and other of the Chabad Chasidis has spread to all the Hasidic groups, and that really was the intention. The Chabad never really said we need everybody to convert to be Chabad, but we do want everybody to study Chabad Chassidic philosophy, and that has, thank God, been spreading out throughout many communities, including those who are not Chabad, and some of those even who are not Chassidic are studying Chabad Chassidic philosophy today. But I wanted to tell you the story that really presents the difference. The story is there was one time a Chassid who was praying. A Chabad Chassid was praying, and he was meditating about God, thinking about God. He spent a lot of effort, but he wasn't really getting that feeling. And then near him was this Chassid, this Hasidic Jew of a different sect, and he was praying with great devotion and intensity and emotion. And the Chabad Chassid felt terrible about himself. He's like, "Look, here I've studied the Hasidic teachings in depth, and this guy doesn't know much, at least of Hasidic philosophy, and he's super emotional. What am I lacking?" So he went to his Rebbe, I forget which Chabad Rebbe it was, and the Rebbe told him, "Don't feel bad." He says, "When you're davening, when you're praying, the emotional devotion that you feel is your prayers. When he is praying, he is not praying with his own devotion, but his Rebbe's devotion." And what he meant by that was in the non-Chabad Hasidic groups, by then they had a lot of, I don't know if you know the other Hasidic groups. A lot is very focused on the Rebbe, their Rebbe, and so they grab gefilte fish and they have these gatherings where they just sing most of the time. You look at the Rebbe's gatherings, there was singing, a lot of singing, but there was even more talking. So they're very much into the emotion, and the Rebbe like inspires them. They watch their Rebbe and they get excited watching the Rebbe. And so Chabad Rebbe's argument is that it's not really them. It's not really them. It's not so identified with them. If they didn't study the topics themselves, they're being excited by something that's more external. It's not really them. When you daven, it's you. And even if your prayers are less than the other person, but those prayers are yours. I want to say, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but this is also one can say why, um, other Hasidic groups, why Chabad, you know. We haven't appointed another Rebbe, because to us a Rebbe is not just a figurehead. Chas v'shalom. Sorry, I don't mean to say by anybody else as a figurehead. Let me take that back. By us, a Rebbe is someone who's obviously has to be a very spiritual man, which we're not going to find someone like the Rebbe. But aside from that, it's someone who can teach the depths of Hasidic philosophy, novel ideas. And so it's not just someone who can be very devout, which you can find some people who can inspire people that way, but someone who can teach the deepest layers of Hasidic philosophy. And there is nobody who has that spirituality to teach new teachings in the depths of Hasidic philosophy. Um, and so. we can continue to go on with the Rebbe's teachings. And again, this all goes back to the Chabad Chassidic philosophy way, which is the Rebbe empowers us to be the best version of ourselves. Not that he inspires us, and just by looking at him, though we do get inspired by looking at the Rebbe, but more importantly, the Rebbe inspires us to be the best version of ourselves. As Lord Jonathan Sacks always said best, great leaders create great followers, and really great leaders create leaders. I'm paraphrasing, but that's really the idea. That's really what a Chabad Rebbe is about. It's not about just giving you some excitement. It's about inspiring you to be the best version of yourself. And that's the whole version of Hasidic philosophy. And that's why, even if emotion is lacking in Chabad Hasidic philosophy, the point was not that you should be emotional. In other words, the objective is obviously the objective is to have emotions to God, but the true objective is that it should be yours. If it's someone else's, then it's not really yours, and then it's not really that's not really what God wants. And so that is why if one does the best that they can, and they still nevertheless don't feel any emotional connection, their service of God is considered whole and complete. So let's read this inside as the Alter Rebbe writes it, and then I'll open up for questions because this is a I really went off a little bit tangent here, but it is such an important Chabad uh, philosophical outlook. Anyway, so he says like this. He says here, even if after contemplating all of this, which was all the topics that would make you feel the awe of God, which was to feel how God is standing over you and God watches over you and God fills the world, and also the meditations of the mitzvahs, if all of this doesn't result in a feeling of awe and trepidation, actually coming upon your heart. Nevertheless, since you've A, accepted God's sovereign authority, and B, you've drawn upon yourself a conscious reverence of God, at least in your thoughts and in the willpower of your brain, you accepted of God's authority and mental reverence together are enough for your worship to be authentic with what the Tanya was trying to refer to as full service. So what he's saying is, if you have obviously accepted God as to do what God asks of you, and you have contemplated as much as you can with your thoughts, then it is considered a full service of God. Now he asks, but if you don't feel like a servant of God in your heart, only in your mind, couldn't that signify that you don't really mean it authentically? Right? So he says like this, even though you don't feel it palpably in your heart, this mental acceptance of God's authority is without a doubt authentic. Why? Because all of Israel have in their inherent soul's disposition not to be insubordinate to the blessed holy king. So he's making an interesting argument here. He's saying, if in your mind you feel like you want to serve God because you've done the meditations, even though it hasn't trickled down to your heart, we know nevertheless that that is your true self. Because of your godly soul, which your godly soul wants to do what God wants, then one should never tell themselves I'm being hypocritical. I don't really feel it. I really feel like I don't want to serve God. Okay, that's your external feeling, but deep down, you truly do want to serve God. So he says like this, so the Torah that you study or the mitzvahs that you perform, as a result of this acceptance of God's authority, and as a result of the conscious reverence felt at least in your brain, is called full service to God, like any service offered by a loyal servant to his master king, which is considered full, so long as the work is done conscientiously and eagerly. Remember, the whole reason why emotion was required in serving God is because in order for it to be called service of God as opposed to service of self, you have to want to be doing it for God. So as long as he's saying here, as long as you can at the very least bring it into your mind, and we connect that with your natural desire to serve God, even if you're not feeling it now, together that creates what is called a genuine and full service of God. All right, he's going to go on in a moment what happens if you serve God without awe and only love. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I did want to see if anybody had any questions because what I presented today was a very, very fascinating thought, at least I think so, about the difference between Chabad philosophy and other Chassidic philosophies and the importance of self-service of God, meaning something that we need to do, not just rely on others. And this is really the calling of the Tanya. The calling of the Tanya is that each and every single one of us needs to consciously and actively work on our service of God and not to rely on the rabbi inspiring you. I mean, obviously the rabbi inspires you, but then you need to do the work yourself. Just by the way, this is one of the reasons I recently also did, I started the Chumash study group because I wanted people not only to come to classes, which one should come to classes, but also we also need some element of self-study, if at all possible. But anyways, that's a little side digression. Any questions or comments on what I said?
Well, I'm trying to understand the parameters of it. It's
Hmm.
seems kind of oversimplified, so I'm trying to understand like the nuances. Like, what does that mean? Like, I don't know how to love him, frankly. I don't know how. Like, I need directions because I wasn't raised with it. So,
Right. So again, maybe you will actually never come to feelings of love to him. Maybe you will, but you need, at the very least, to study topics and think of topics and meditate on topics that should lead to love of God, which all those topics can be found in Hasidic philosophy and the different books from a classic Chabad library. But that's really the parameter. The parameter is that for in order to serve God, ideally we should feel it in our hearts, but that feeling has to come from our work. And in order for that feeling to come from our work, we need to meditate. And if we meditate on these topics and we don't come to feel it, we have done our part. Now, um, the more difficult part is that a lot of these topics of Hasidic philosophy it's hard to wrap your head around, and they're very deep, and maybe I should do a better job at teaching you more Hasidic topics. Um, my holiday series that I did earlier this year is probably the closest thing I've taught of it in recent times. But that's an example of the type of topics we're talking about. But I mean, even studying the Tanya, certain sections of the Tanya are technical, but certain sections of the Tanya can also lead you to a love of God. But also don't forget, uh, Hasidic philosophy understands everybody works layer to layer. When you first start studying, you start with the simple stuff, and then you go deeper and deeper. Good question. Any other questions? No. I want to add one more thing, and I'm just looking here for my book. Here, oh, here's the book. The book. Just wanted to show you what a book of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov looks like. So, if you see here, they're short pieces. Okay, like that's one piece. The next piece goes from here till there. So it's a bunch of short pieces. That's what all the other Hasidic groups are looking at. All these little short teachings. This is from the Maggid of Mezrich. Okay, even the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, who taught longer Hasidic teachings, even he, before he got arrested, his teachings were shorter. And then after his liberation, his teachings got longer. And that was actually, everyone wonders, Chabad and Chabad, we say the day the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, got out of jail as a holiday. What exactly was the holiday? It means that heaven agreed to his way of serving God, or his path in service of God. But what exactly does that mean? Well, now you know the secret. Is that what was happening was the Alter Rebbe was different than all of his colleagues, all of the other students of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid and Mezrich. They were all still teaching all their general students short Hasidic teachings. And the Alter Rebbe was the first one that said, no, we need to teach people long sections so they can think themselves, they can meditate themselves, they can understand the concepts themselves. That's what Chabad means. Chabad means to understand, right? And that's why he was thrown in prison. It says that what we believe it was a heavenly decree that against these teachings. But ultimately, he was freed from prison, and our tradition tells us that the Alter Rebbe says that the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Mezrich, who had passed away already, visited him in his prison cell, and they told him why he was put in prison for the teachings that he was spreading. But they also, and then he asked them, should I stop? And they said, no, now that you started, once you get out of prison, you should do it even more because heaven has agreed to what you're doing. So the whole story of the liberation and arrest, the arrest and liberation of the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, was surrounded around this topic, around teaching the deepest secrets of the Torah in ways that regular people can understand. Okay, so that's what the whole story is, and this is the uniqueness of Chabad Hasidus. There's other Hasidic groups out there, but this is the uniqueness of Chabad Hasidus. So, um, and so that's why I felt it was important to digress on this, so that you understand what is unique about Chabad Hasidus. Now, the Alter Rebbe, after he was freed from prison, his teachings became longer, and then his son's teachings became longer. So it's only developed further since then, the depth in which we study the Hasidic concepts. Anyways, um, with that being said, I'm going to move on to the next topic unless anyone has any other questions, because the next topic is a little different. Okay, no other questions, so I'll move on to the next topic. It's a lot to think about. I do love discussion and questions. Never feel worried about asking me a question. But let's move on to the next section. So the next section is where we're kind of going to shift gears. We finished the topic for the moment. We're going to get back to it. We finished the topic for the moment about awe of God. All right, let's take a note here. I believe we experience awe for God more often than we realize. We simply don't always recognize it as such. Um, you're saying sometimes people do emotionally feel awe of God. They just don't recognize they're feeling that awe of God. It's entirely possible. I think there's also an entirely group of people out there who are generally not in touch with their emotions. So a lot of times I tell people is that sometimes your lack of feeling emotions towards God, like how in general, how in general you're in touch with your emotions. It may be you're not that in touch with your emotions, hence you're not going to feel your emotions to God. Um, which is another form of the problem. But anyways, all right. So now the question is going to be, is awe of God enough? Is the awe of God enough in our divine service of God? Right? So we learned that even before we love God, awe of God is the source and the basis, and uh, the root of serving God is we need to, we gave an example with marriages, right? If you have a marriage or an emotion, you need to have the awe. So I'm getting here, yes, awe is not enough. Um, but why not? Why is awe of God not enough? If it gets the job done,
Because it's mitzvah, it's about mitzvahs.
okay, but I can make the argument that the awe of God will make you do a mitzvah. If you know that God wants you to do a mitzvah, the awe will make you do it. It's like if you have
Because
awe of your parent and they ask you to do something, you might do it, right?
awe comes and goes.
I would argue the opposite, actually. I would say love comes and goes more than awe does, no? They both can come and go. But at the very least, accepting God's authority doesn't come and go. Let's put it that way. Okay, the accepting God as your king, if you take that acceptance, even if there's no feeling, you're going to get the job done. So what's the problem with awe alone? In other words, I would make the argument that awe is better. Awe is more likely to get the job done. Think of it in a marriage, the basic acceptance of commitment to each other is what's going to make you um, continuously stick in your marriage, even when sometimes love is not there. All right, so someone writes here, he wants you to love him with all your heart, with all your might. He wants both. All right, good. That's correct. It says in the Torah that God wants both. He wants both awe and love, as it says in the V'ahavta, you should love the God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. But I'm asking, and again, God can want anything, and we can't really question why God wants something, but sometimes we can understand to an extent. So, why is love important? Assuming someone has awe of God, which we explained is the first thing that someone has to have acceptance of God as king and awe of God. Why would someone need love? Aside from obviously God wanting it. But what do you think? What do you think love
Because
adds? Yes.
God created us to seek him by needing love. Like he created us in that way. that we could have a deeper relationship with him.
So right. So you said something there, but we need to develop it a little more. What exactly is missing in a relationship with awe that love can bring to the table?
Does awe separate us a little bit and teach us his like um the hierarchy?
You said awe separates us?
Like it separates us and teaches us about leadership and hierarchy and like that his word is like kind of it creates parent and child rather than like husband and wife. Like he's
Creates
above us.
parents and child. Okay. Um,
So we'd be more obedient because of that.
mhm. Okay. So you think there's more obedience with love?
With awe, there's more obedience than love.
Right, correct. Awe creates more obedience. So the question is, so what does love add? We definitely, I think we all agree. Awe
Oh, I
brings
see what you
obedience.
mean. Love helps us find our way back to like our humanity, our vulnerability. Then we can love each other more.
But let's talk about love to God. What does love to God add? As if I'm going to be obedient because I have awe of God, I've accepted Him as my King. I'm going to put on tefillin. I'm going to sit in the circle. I'm going to do all these things. Here I'm using on fear interchangeably. Yes, one can split it. But right now, my question is, if someone has already an awe or a fear of God or accepts God's yoke, he's accepting to what God wants. We know he's going to be the most obedient. But what is lacking in his service of God that that love will add to it?
Oh,
Obviously
feeling,
not action,
feeling.
feeling. Good, good. So awe or right, awe or devotion or accepting the yoke of heaven all really just makes you do it. And it's very important that we accept the obedience of God. Think of it in an army, right? In an army, whenever we have a relationship with something that is much greater than us, love is never enough. You can get away with love in a friendship. You can get away with love in a marriage, though long term it probably won't work. But you can't. But when it comes to an army or something like that, when the difference between the two people that are having a relationship is very far, there's a required level of obedience and awe. Just like an army, a soldier needs to have that awe and reverence towards the general and follow whatever is said. You can't just say, well, I don't feel like it. So that's the basis. However, if you just have that there's not a lot of, like you said, kind of the feeling, it doesn't permeate the person. We want people who are not just willing to do everything the king says, but to do it with their entire being. And in order for them to do it with their entire being, they need to do it with love. So yes, love is one form of the kavanah. Kavanah meaning, why am I doing the mitzvah? We were asking, what does love add? In other words, if the goal was just to get the job done, then awe, reverence alone would work. But the job is not just to get it done, but get it done with your entire being. That's why, it says to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That's what love can add. Love can add, you bring your entire being into it. You show up fully. You're not just going to get it done, but you're going to do it. I know it sounds almost the same, but that's kind of the way we would describe it. Think of it in your own life. Um, are we doing it with zest, or are we doing it with just strictual feeling? And this, by the way, will explain a lot of our prayers, as he's going to point out. One of the most famous prayers that expresses this is the prayer Avinu Malkeinu. What does Avinu Malkeinu mean?
Our Father, our King.
Our Father, our King, right? So, what does it even mean, our Father, our King? Is he our Father or is he our King? Now, maybe some of you grew up in a house where your father was the king as well.
True.
Uh, huh?
True.
Right, right. But really, they're generally separate things. It actually says that a king cannot be a king over just his family. In other words, if a guy declares himself as king, but his only subjects are his family, he's not really a king. A true king is someone who's a king over foreign subjects. But then that's a discussion for another time. The point is that there's a parent relationship and there's a king relationship. Very good. Awe is more transcendent and a reverent awareness of God's greatness, and love is God's immanence. That's a good way of putting it. Um, yeah, because the relationship of the king, the relationship of us to the king is a reverence, okay? Avinu Malkenu, that's Malkenu our king, but Avinu our father is like a parent and a child. That's a love relationship, that's a closer relationship. And we actually have that same thing in in the entire liturgy of the high holidays and other times of the year as well. But we have the liturgy of the holidays, we have you might quote it in a second. We say im kivanim im kavadim. We say after we blow the shofar, we have a short prayer there. Areshes sefaseinu, the movement of our lips, and over there we say im kivanim. We turn to God and we say, if we are like children, have mercy upon us like a father to a child. The im kavadim. If we are like servants, our eyes are turned to you, our master, and we will supplicate to you and for you to answer our prayers. So we see these two ideas in the prayers is that we relate to God both as a king and a father, and that's because we need both. We need to have, on the one hand, the reverence of God, because God is distant from us, truthfully, but we also need to have the love of God, as someone said here, the immanence of God, and to really bring in our entire being. Let's take a look at the Tanya now, the actual text. Okay, so Tanya says here. All right, later in the chapter, we'll discuss worship carried out with acceptance of God's authority alone, without any mental or emotional reverence, and we will argue that it still represents a level of service. But as the Tanya will now demonstrate, worship is not motivated by any acceptance of God's authority at all. Sorry. Sorry. Okay, so first the Tanya is going to say that if you just have love of God and no reverence, that's not good enough. But he's going to say, of course, if you don't have love, it's also not good enough. We need both. Okay, so he says this is not the case. However, if you study Torah, observe a mitzvah out of love alone without any basic obedience or reverence at the moment, it's not considered service of God at all. It's because love, truthfully, is an extension of ourselves. We love that which makes us feel good. Love naturally is more about us. Okay, whereas reverence is less about us. It could be the case that generally speaking, you do accept God's authority and you do revere him, but for your act of Torah or study to be considered genuine service of God and not self-service, it needs to be directly associated with an acceptance of God's authority. And that's true even if you're observing a positive commandment, which is typically considered to be more an expression of love than reverence. So we're getting from the Tanya a very important point. Every single mitzvah you do needs to have love and reverence of God. And love alone, even in a positive commandment, if you sit in the sukkah because you love God so much, that's not enough. You need to have the reverence. You need to first say, God, I'm going to do what you want. And I love this sukkah. You know? If you perform the mitzvah exclusively with the feeling of love, that you want to connect him through his Torah and his mitzvos, but you lacked an acceptance of God's authority at that moment, it would not be termed service of a loyal servant. Why is it so important that your worship is motivated by acceptance of God's authority and as a result falls under the category of service? What's lacking if you just perform a mitzvah because you love God and you don't act like an obedient service? The Tanya now brings clarification of this point from both Scripture and Zohar. Service of God is necessary since the Torah said, you shall serve God your God, and it is him that you shall serve. So service comes from reverence, not from love. The fact that the Torah describes all worship of God as service indicates that accepting his authority and reverence should underline each and every act of worship. As the Zohar states, in Parshas Bahar, like an ox that must first have a yoke placed upon it so that it can become useful to the world, likewise, a person must first accept the yoke of God's sovereign authority, and if this doesn't happen to him, holiness won't rest in him. So you could love God all day, But if there's no reverence, you're lacking in the service of God. This citation from the Zohar stresses 2 points. Number one, in the traditional paradigm, you are told to accept God's authority and obey him because he's more powerful than you, and you do so because you're afraid of punishment. That's because you look at yourself as a tiny separate fragment in the universe that can easily be crushed. So you obey the master of the universe to ensure the continuation of your separate entity, of your separate survival. But in the Hasidic mystical paradigm, you see yourself as fundamentally interconnected with God's light and everything in the universe. You seek a growing openness and gradual dissolution of the separation between yourself, your environment, and God. Hello? Yeah. You know that your narcissistic shell and ego need to be loosened rather like unclenching a fist in order for you to become more open to the infinite. So you look at acceptance of God's authority as your key to transcending the ego and accessing sacred light. Accessing sacred light. 1 second.
Thank you for that beautiful meal.
And accepting sacred light. Okay. So number one is we need reverence. We need reverence because without the reverence, we may feel separate from God. That's what love makes us feel separate from God. And even fear of punishment makes us feel separate from God. Only reverence and awe of God, when we see ourselves as fundamentally dissolving ourselves into God, that is where we allow God to rest upon us. Because God doesn't rest on ego, God rests on bitul, nullifying ourselves to him. Number two, the Zohar emphasizes that Kabbalah style accepting yoke of heaven is necessary for positive activity. Like an ox that must first have a yoke placed upon it so that it can become useful to the world. This supports the Tanya assertion through this chapter that Kabbalah style accepting yoke of heaven should motivate even the observance of positive commandments. And then he continues as proofs of the idea that we need to have both, that we need to have service of God in addition to love. And in the section of Zohar entitled Raya Mehemna, 111b, it's taught that every person ought to function in 2 ways, i.e., 2 levels in his or her relationship with God, both as a servant who acts out reverence and trepidation, and as a child who acts out of love. The Zohar teaches Israel are referred to with 2 names by the Blessed Holy One. They are called servants, as the verse states, they are my servants, and they are called children, as the verse states, you are, and I explained this before, so I'm going a little bit quicker about the idea that we are both servants and children. To God, your God. But though you are called a child, you must not exclude yourself from being a servant who serves his father and everything that glorifies his father. This adds further support to Tanya's assertion in this chapter that Kabbalah soul and reverence, the approach of a servant, applies to all worship, everything that glorifies his father, even positive commandments. So again, the point is we need to have both a reverence, which opens us up to the divine light, and a love of God, which allows us to feel a closeness and allows us to give more vitality and life into our doing the mitzvos. And he says, and while there is such a thing as a child who also has the virtue of a servant, this doesn't invalidate the above point. So I mentioned earlier, right? Some people in their home, their father is a king. So the child may love his or her parent so much so that he is totally devoted to the parent and wants nothing other than to fulfill the wishes of the parent. Couldn't you in a similar fashion just love God so much and so selflessly you'd be willing to do anything that he wants? There does seem to be a scenario where love alone could motivate a person to a level of service without the need for reverence, a conclusion which is at odds with the theme of this chapter. So the Tanya answers, while there is such a theme as a child who is motivated only by love and not as reverence, it's impossible to reach such a level without first acquiring higher reverence, as intelligent people realize. So in other words, if you were a great tzaddik, if you were a super righteous person, your love alone of God could help you reach a complete reverence. Reverence meaning giving yourself over to God. But for the average person, selfless love is hard to reach. And let me just read it as he writes it. As we shall see in the coming chapters, love and reverence are experiences which follow a developmental line. Selfless love, the child who is also a servant, is in all but most mature cases a contradiction in terms, because love is usually an expression of self. Selfless love does exist, but it is an advanced state which must be preceded by a series of emotional growth phases. Most notably, the Tanya stresses here, selfless love must follow a deep transpersonal phase, which the Zohar refers to as higher reverence. We will discuss below exactly what this means, but it's clear that there's no path to worship that does not begin with and is built on reverence. So just to give you a heads up, later in Tanya develops this idea that love exists on two levels and reverence exists on two levels. There is a basic reverence and a basic love. Those are called the lower reverence and the lower love, which we've been discussing now. Then there's a higher reverence and a higher love, which we'll discuss in future chapters. And those are all possible, but they go step by step. Yes, Tanya, you have a question? No? Okay. Um, so that they go, yes? Question? No question? So they go step by step. And uh the best thing I can compare it to again is I'm going to go with marriage. In the beginning of a marriage, there's a very serious requirement for commitment. Okay? No worries. In the beginning of a marriage, there's a very serious requirement for commitment. Without that commitment, love alone will not carry it through. However, it is possible, and you could see this sometimes with much older couples. And even then, I'm not sure it's exactly the same as the Tanya is describing, but you can get the idea that the commitment there is based on a love. They've lived with each other so long, they're completely devoted to each other, and seemingly it's no longer a necessity where they need to accept upon themselves the commitment. I have committed myself to being married to this person, to making this work, but they've come to such a level of love after living with a person for so long that they are also completely given over based on love. So I think we have a similar concept. Thank you, David. So I think we have a similar concept here that we're talking about here. In other words, there is a possibility that one day we can reach this higher level of reverence. We have spoken, by the way, earlier about the higher level of love. I don't know if you remember. We spoke about this burning, flaming desire. Most of us are not there. But it is possible that if we raise ourselves up, we go from basic reverence to basic love to advanced reverence to advanced love. I believe that's how That's how it works. But for most of us, we are stuck. We're not stuck. We need to make sure at this point in our lives, for most of us, that we have a devotion of God that is based on reverence, because a devotion based on love will be too centered around myself and will not give the lasting power that is required in our relationship. At the same time, we also need to have a love of God, because without the love of God, we are lacking in really fully pulling ourselves into this relationship with God. He's going to discuss that more later, but that was his point. His point here. Wondering if I should go to the next point here. His next point is basically like this. His next point is that he's just going to make this point. He's going to say that sometimes it's possible. I think I'll leave it for next time. We did two very big topics today. So I'm going to leave it at those two big topics. The two big topics today was the general Hasidic view is that we need to work on our divine service of God ourselves. Sorry, the Chabad view. And that's what should be creating our emotions. Emotions are never promised. Therefore, if we at the very least work on meditating, thinking, contemplating about God, and we have accepted God as our King, even if we don't come to a heartfelt feeling of reverence to God, that is um, good enough to be considered as fully serving God. In addition to the fact that we have a hidden reverence of God in our souls, it's considered authentic. The second point we discussed was the concept of our relationship with God requires both love and reverence. Love alone is not enough, because love alone is more self, and we need to make sure we have divine service of God, which means we are doing it because of God, not because of us. And that opens us up to bring God into our lives. So it's very easy to be religious, but to be very self-focused and to think about yourself. And ultimately, our purpose is to serve God, not to serve ourselves. So even if I appreciate connecting to God, even that alone is not enough. The basis of my service to God has to be reverence, which is a basic acceptance of God. In other words, like this, it is a beautiful thing to love God and to want to connect to Him, but at the same time, your desire and want to connect to Him also means that it's about you. And at a very basic level, we need to have it not about us. So my love can be about me to a certain extent, but I need to also have reverence because reverence says it's about God. First and foremost, it's about God. Then on top of that, I layer my love, and love adds the element of a closer connection. But um, if we just had the love, then we would not be opening ourselves up for God to rest in our lives and to rest within our personal being because there would be too much of me. And anytime there's too much of me, there's no place for God. If it's all about me and what I want and what I desire, then it's not good enough. There's a famous statement of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe used to say, "I don't want your Gan Eden. I don't want your Olam Haba. I just want you alone." So that's already one layer. Is number one is don't desire God for any personal benefits. But we're saying in this chapter is that even that love alone, if someone their love is completely for God, unless they're a high level of tzaddik, they still need the reverence because without the reverence, it's still about them. It's their personal desire for God, even if they weren't desiring God for Gan Eden, even if they weren't desiring God for the benefits that God could give them, they were just desiring God alone for God. But since it's a personal desire, therefore it's automatically personal. Um, think about it like this. When you love someone, the starting point is you. When you have reverence, the starting point is the other person. So let's say I give someone charity. The starting point is I feel bad for that person. Then I'm giving them charity. So even though I'm doing something for someone else, I'm giving them because I feel bad for them. Um, when you have reverence for someone and you're doing what they say, the starting point is your feeling of them, not your feeling of yourself, not your bad feeling. And as when you give, I feel bad for them. Therefore, I'm going to give. Reverence is you're you're just a nobody or nothing, and you just stand in awe of that person and will do whatever they say. That's really what true reverence is. When you're in the presence of greatness, you don't feel yourself so much. You just do. There are some people who have relationships with great people, but not a level of reverence. It's a level of love and awe, and therefore it's not a true. It's not a full connection. Anyways, all right. So hopefully you have two things to walk away with: personal service of God, and also the requirement for both reverence and love. And we will meet again next week to develop these ideas further as we try to explore our love and awe of God, which is a necessary component of bringing God into our lives and connecting with God in our day-to-day service. Thank you, and Chodesh Tov, everybody.
Chodesh Tov.